most of you already know the story of Jesus, born in Bethlehem, was considered a child prodigy, was in the temple preaching. We don't have much detail other than just his birth and that one story about him being in the temple preaching. Then we don't really hear much from Jesus Christ until his 30s, in which he starts his active ministry, where he goes around preaching radical ideas that were contrary to Jewish belief at the time. And then it's no doubt why he was crucified, if he's running around preaching that he's the Son of God, which in Jewish beliefs at the time, there was no such thing as a Son of God. So it is no surprise that's why they considered him to be a blasphemer, and so went ahead and crucified him around 33 AD. So then the next event that emerges is we have Paul, who comes on the scene, who picks up and jumps on the bandwagon and says that to provide validity to his claim, says, oh, I met Jesus. I met him on the road to Damascus, and here's what my encounter was like, and he told me to go on and carry on the torch for Christianity, and that's what he says. And then Paul goes on and writes several letters to the churches around the area and writes his epistles. And it's interesting to note that some of those epistles, out of all the ones that appear and are attributed to Paul in the New Testament, only 7 of them are uncontested. So basically, you have 7 authentically validated epistles that were written by Paul. Now, the remainder of them, and I can't recall off the top of my head which ones they are not written by Paul. But we'll save that for another discussion. So you have the early writings of Paul, which form much of the early church belief about Christianity and what we're supposed to believe. And then you have, and the dating for those are around the late 40s, although some Christians want to push it closer to the early 40s because of the time of the crucifixion to get it close. But really, we're looking at roughly about maybe 20 years after the crucifixion, Paul begins to pick up the torch and carries on the banner for Christianity. And one thing that's interesting to note too is that Paul doesn't really, in his writings, doesn't really cover in the detail like you find in the New Testament Gospels about the life of Jesus. It's almost as if like Paul doesn't know anything about the crucifixion, doesn't know, he doesn't really talk about it. What he talks about is early church theology. And so I think that's kind of interesting to bring up, but we can maybe go into that later in more in depth. So Paul's writings, late 40s, 50s, and then early 60s. And then we have with the New Testament Gospels emerging around the 70 AD, which is the book of Mark. And the dating for that is attributed to 70 AD because in the book of Mark it mentions the destruction of the Jewish temple, the destruction of Jerusalem, which was said to have happened around 70 AD. So because the book of Mark mentions that, most scholars agree that's the dating for it. Then we have the book of Matthew, which is funny to note. Matthew shows up first in the New Testament, but it was not written first. Matthew was actually written after Mark. And there's some debate about where they got the information. There's this thing called the Q source, which they say a lot of the information that appear in the first, I believe it's Synoptic Bible, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Luke are considered the Synoptics. They say that they use the Q source, which is this unknown source, to get the information because there's a lot of similarities in stories between Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But the dating, I said 70 AD for Mark, and then a little bit later for Matthew, Luke, maybe the 80s, and then some have pushed out the writings of John, St. John, the book of John, to as late as the first century, 100 AD. So, and because we have a lot of detail in there about the life of Jesus, which is rather suspect to me, because how is it that 40-something years after the life of Jesus would we have conversations? Now, of course, the Christian response to that is the oral traditions. The oral tradition was passed down and passed down and passed down about what Jesus said, but that's, to me, very much like the telephone game. You try passing down four decades of information verbatim. I mean, we have. So I don't think that we're really dealing with an authentic historical transcript of the words of Jesus, the life of Jesus, and we can go into that more in greater depth at another time. But just to keep it brief, so there you have, the 4 Gospels, the dating for them. And then, have you ever wondered, how it is the Bible, the New Testament Bible, became what it is today? Well, in the early days, you had around 200 AD, the 2nd century there, we have some early church fathers Bishop Irenaeus, who was trying to put together which books should stay in the New Testament, put together a more formalized book, and basically what he was working on the New Testament Bible at that time. And so he went through using a methodology, and he had a system that he used, and whatever books didn't consist with his theology, what he wanted to have in there, they basically were pushed aside and not included. What's interesting to note about this is the books that he didn't include were basically books that were unknown in origin. Basically, the authors were unknown. And like I mentioned before, the four Gospels are not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are not the authors' names, though we attribute them for many years. Most scholars agree that those aren't the authors of those books. You say, well then who authored those books? We don't know. They're unknown too. So it just goes to show that because the theology was consistent, because the stories were sensational, because it helped sell Christianity, they were used. But there were many other books that were just, if not more sensational, and those books were called the Apocrypha, and basically meaning unknown. They don't know who wrote those books. And also within the Bible, there are books called pseudographical books, which are basically, my understanding was that they were books that are also, they're books that are supposed to be written by a certain person, like with Paul, but are actually written by somebody else. So they're basically, it's like me saying I wrote, say, Angels and Demons, although I have the same name as Dan Brown, is the guy that writes that book. But you get the point. It's just someone says it's written by this person, but it's really not, and that's what a pseudographical book is. So just some terminology, some verbiage to use, because I think it'll be interesting on your journey, or as you're looking up information, to have a context of what that's all about. So we talked there. I know I digressed a little bit, but we have the Gospels. Okay, we talked about that. We talked about how we formed the Bible, the New Testament Bible, and basically, the Bishop Irenaeus writes that. And so the Bible, the books of the Bible were collected and brought together to basically present a consistent message. So there were many other books out there that were written that were not included, that probably had more heretical, things that were considered heresy at the time, that were not included. So that's the formation of the New Testament Bible. And so then it's interesting to also note, within the first 300 years or so of Christianity, you also had a lot of debating going on back and forth, as if like things were not established right away. It took hundreds and hundreds of years for them to settle the issue of Jesus' divinity. In other words, was Jesus really the Son of God? Was he really fully God and fully man? How was this possible? How could a God be fully human yet be fully divine at the same time? So his divinity was questioned for the first 300 years, and maybe even longer. But I know for a fact, based on his study that I've done, that around 380 AD, they came together with the Council of Nicaea to basically to squelch a lot of the debating that was going on within the early Christian church. And they're going back and forth. There were many church fathers, bishops, that were saying, look, I don't think this. I think that Jesus was maybe a great prophet, maybe he was a great teacher, but to say that he was the Son of the living God, to say that he was fully divine, and he has the attributes, that's going too far. So they had the New Testament Gospels there as their supposed historical record. So my question is, if they had those as evidence, why would there be any debating at all? Now, I guess the response could be that, well, men are always going to debate things, and no men are going to agree on everything. But it's like, if Jesus really existed, and we have a historical, you're only talking 300 years after the time of Jesus, and they still don't have this solidified. They still don't have this together. So in order to unify the church under one belief system, they had to establish a type of creed that would say, hey, this is what we believe in. And that's what the Council of Nicaea did, was they brought forth the Nicea Creed, which basically said, we believe that Jesus was the Son of the living God, and so he basically established his divinity. Prior to that, it was debated. So you can see that within the first few hundred years of Christianity, everything wasn't, hunky-dory. There was a lot of debating going on. And so another noteworthy event that took place during this time in early Christianity was Emperor Constantine. And what he did for Christianity was he basically established Christianity as the state religion for the Roman Empire. And whether or not this was done as an act of faith, we don't really know. his mother was a Christian, but we don't know whether, he was a full Christian or not, or whether he just saw this as an opportunity to unify his empire under a one-state religion and bring everyone together, because that's what he did. He went ahead, and basically Christianity was able to flourish throughout Rome because of the efforts of that Roman emperor. Excuse me. So that's another key point to mention. And then we have several debates and things that went on after that within Christianity. There was a lot of other councils that were established to try to clean up, what is the Christian belief, and what do we believe in, what do we stand for. So it continued to evolve, and there was an issue that happened in the 1050 AD, which was the Great Schism, and that was an interesting event that took place within the Catholic Church at that time, because yes, that's what it was. There was no Protestantism. It was basically the Catholic Church at that time, and what they were doing was, there was a Pope in Rome and there was a Pope in France, and they couldn't have the papacy, I think it's called. They couldn't have that. It caused, you can't have like two presidents. There couldn't be two presidents of the United States. There had to be one, one Rome, and he was one Pope in Rome, and that was it. So that was caused the Great Schism between the church, and it caused the East and the West church to split. You had the Orthodox Catholic Church and the non-Orthodox Church splitting. There were also other splits that were happening at that time within Christianity, and it was because of the beliefs and the practices of the church at the time. And one of those things was a thing called iconoclast, which basically was praying and image worshiping, basically worshiping, like statues, worshiping pictures. The Bible speaks in the Old Testament about having no graven images, and here you have some of the early Christian followers doing exactly what the Bible speaks out against. So that caused a split within the church at the time because of those things going on. I always heard growing up that the Catholics prayed to Mary and they prayed to the saints, and these were beliefs that the church held on to, which were not consistent with what the Bible teaches. And there were other things that were happening at the time where the Catholic Church was basically saying, hey, if you give us so much money, we can save your child. They basically died before baptism. There was a lot of different things that were going on. They were just not scriptural. And so, we move forward to the 1500s, and, in between 1050 AD and 1500, all these things were going on, and the church was being scrutinized, because at this time, too, we also have the Dark Ages, in which, many people were calling into question, if God really loves us, why is this happening? What's going on? Why is all this suffering, the plague, the Black Death? Why is we're devout followers? Why is God punishing us? So the church didn't have any response to that, and so that was another thing that happened and really kind of called into question. People should have probably, and many people maybe did wonder at that time, is this whole Christianity thing real or not? But you have the church doing a lot of things that they shouldn't have done in the Middle Ages, and then you have the 1500s, where basically Martin Luther comes upon the scene and writes his 99 Theses and says, look, this is my issues with the Catholic Church, and of course they don't appreciate that, and they excommunicate him, and he's basically ostracized, and he goes on to start the Protestant Reformation, which basically was a move away from Catholicism and was the basically emergence of the Protestant denomination within Christianity. So very interesting stuff. You have Martin Luther starting this Protestantism for the next 500 years or so has been going on, and it's really, really interesting. Really interesting stuff. So let me stop and pay my toll. Good day. Got to pay the toll. So, and then I lost you. Okay, so I'm back. So 1500 AD, Martin Luther comes on the scene, and he's bringing up all the issues that he has, and there's other followers that jump on board. John Calvin, who started Calvinism. There was a few others. There was a Swedish scholar who went on and basically kind of piggybacked and said he didn't pick up his information from from Martin Luther, but it's very, very similar in ideas, and so he probably did. But so for the last 500 years, you've had Protestantism within Christianity has continued to emerge and has gone on, and you see the emergence of all these different denominations, the Baptist and the Pentecostal and the Lutheran, and if you I have a really interesting chart that I could show you, but I don't have it with me, but it basically does the breakdown of the early Christian church. It shows you all the different sects that break off. And so one thing I want to make a note of is that if you think about it, if today's Protestant Christianity is different than Catholicism, and Catholicism and Christianity is different than Judaism, and Judaism is different than Zoroastrianism. I mean, it's just, you can just see how they're just piggybacking on each other, and they're just basically hijacking another religion and moving and taking the pieces, and then they want to, these groups of people, these movements are started, and they want to sell their religion. So I think what happened with Christianity is you have basically them hijacking another religion, which is Judaism, which existed. They had the Old Testament, which they brought in to provide more credibility for the Christian faith, because they're really, if you just had the New Testament, that alone would be like any other book. It would be like, okay, yeah, we have the writings of Paul, and because Paul says it, it's true, and but Paul tries to create that lineage between what he says to the Old Testament. He tries to draw it, though, because he can throw back to the Old Testament. That means that it's true. That means that what he says is true. I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Because he references back to it, and throughout the New Testament Bible, there's many references back to the Old Testament to try to provide credibility. But many times when they do that, they don't even quote the actual verses correctly. They will leave things out. The writers of the Gospels will try to refer back to a passage and use it as like prophecy, and it's not even in the context of what they were talking about, or they'll misquote it. So I think that's rather suspect. But within Christianity, I mean, it's just amazing to me, all the stuff that's gone on. And in today's Protestant Christianity, with all the different beliefs, we have the emerging church, you have these mega churches, we have the prosperity gospels, which is debated. I mean, what you see is even today in modern Christianity, it's continuing to evolve. The theology is continuing to develop. For the last 100 years, it's evolved. We went through the charismatic movement in the 60s. I mean, and Christians today will think that for the last 2,000 years, that Christianity through and through has been consistently the same, but it's not. The belief system has been changing. Their theology has been changing. It's not been consistent. What you will find is with Judaism is it has been consistent. They basically have not changed. And so am I saying that you should become a Jew? No, but I think it's just important to note that that's where Christianity gets its basic foundations from, is through Judaism. And it's amazing to me that Christians can assert and say that, Christianity, we know more than the Jews, and they go back and interpret a Jewish, Bible, the Jewish Old Testament, and say that, we know more, and the Jews, they failed to see that Jesus was the Messiah, because, it says here that God blinded their eyes, and blah, 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 this and that. It just seems kind of like, I know you are, but what am I? It seems like a very childish explanation for when, look, the Jews were here before you, the religion of Judaism was here before you, you're a Johnny-come-lately, you showed up on the scene, and you're trying to provide credibility by using somebody else's Old Testament Bible to try to justify or bring credibility to your religion. And then I think that's what happens with Christianity. Because people will disagree, because it's my opinion, I'm entitled to it, but I think very much so that that's what happened with Christianity. But anyways, there is a very, not so brief, but brief rundown of the history of Christianity, and I would like to go into some of these topics even more, explain it further, because I touched on some things that really need to be expounded upon, so I will save that for another time. We'll see you then.